The heavy oak doors of the Pentagon's most secure briefing room swung open with a soft creak. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stepped inside, his crisp white naval uniform a stark contrast to the sea of olive green that filled the room. The 26-year-old officer carried himself with quiet confidence, though his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in 48 hours. The war room buzzed with tension. Maps covered every wall, marked with red pins and strategic notations. 3 massive screens displayed real-time satellite feeds from the Persian Gulf, where American naval forces had been engaged in a delicate standoff with enemy vessels for the past week. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but it couldn't cut through the thick atmosphere of stress and urgency that permeated the space. General Harrison Blackwood dominated the center of the room like a thundercloud. At 55, he was a walking monument to military tradition, his chest decorated with enough ribbons and medals to stock a small museum. His silver hair was cut to regulation perfection, and his steely gray eyes missed nothing. He had earned his reputation through decades of successful operations, and he wore his authority like armor. "Gentlemen," General Blackwood's voice boomed across the room, commanding immediate attention from every person present. "We're here to discuss Operation Maritime Shield, our response to the crisis in the Gulf. Admiral Richardson will brief us on the current situation." Admiral Richardson, a distinguished man in his early 60s with weathered hands that spoke of years at sea, stepped forward. Behind him sat 4 other admirals, each representing different aspects of naval operations. These were men who had commanded aircraft carriers, led submarine fleets, and coordinated massive naval exercises. Their collective experience spanned over 2 centuries of naval service. "The situation remains critical," Admiral Richardson began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the circumstances. "Enemy forces have positioned themselves strategically across key shipping lanes. Our intelligence suggests they're planning a coordinated attack on civilian cargo vessels. We need to respond swiftly but carefully to avoid escalating into full-scale conflict." As the Admiral spoke, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell quietly took a seat in the back corner of the room. He pulled out a small notebook and began reviewing his own notes, occasionally glancing up at the large screens displaying the Gulf region. His presence went largely unnoticed by most of the room's occupants, which was exactly how he preferred it. General Blackwood's attention, however, was drawn to the young officer like a magnet. His eyes narrowed as he took in Mitchell's relatively modest rank insignia and youthful appearance. In a room full of eagles and stars, the twin silver oak leaves of a lieutenant commander seemed almost insulting to the general's sensibilities. "Excuse me." General Blackwood interrupted Admiral Richardson mid-sentence, his voice carrying across the room with the force of artillery fire. Every conversation stopped instantly. "Who exactly authorized junior personnel to attend this classified briefing?" The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. All eyes turned toward Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, who looked up from his notebook with calm composure. He had experienced this type of reception before, though rarely in such high-stakes circumstances. "Sir, I was requested to attend by Admiral Richardson," Mitchell replied respectfully, his voice neither defensive nor apologetic. He had learned long ago that explanation, not excuses, served him better in these situations. General Blackwood's face reddened slightly, a telltale sign that his famous temper was beginning to surface. "Admiral, with all due respect, this briefing involves matters of national security and strategic military planning. This is not the place for—" He paused, looking Mitchell up and down dismissively. "Junior officers to play note-taker." Admiral Richardson shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between protocol and something else the others in the room couldn't yet understand. "General Blackwood, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's presence is not only authorized, but essential to our discussion today." "Essential?" General Blackwood's voice rose slightly, and several junior staff members exchanged nervous glances. "Admiral, I've been fighting wars since this boy was probably building sandcastles. What could a lieutenant commander possibly contribute to a strategic discussion of this magnitude? Does he have some special expertise in international maritime law? Has he commanded a destroyer, led a battle group?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mitchell remained seated, his expression unchanged, though several people in the room noticed his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He had dealt with skepticism about his age and rank throughout his career, but rarely had it been delivered with such public humiliation. "Perhaps," General Blackwood continued, now fully warming to his theme, "the lieutenant commander could wait outside with the other support staff while the adults discuss matters of war and peace. I'm sure there are some reports that need copying or coffee that needs fetching." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room from some of the junior staff, though the admirals remained stone-faced. Admiral Richardson's expression had grown increasingly stern, and Admiral Chen, who had been quietly reviewing documents, looked up with what appeared to be barely contained anger. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell slowly closed his notebook and placed it on the table in front of him. For a moment, it seemed he might respond to the general's provocations, but instead, he simply folded his hands and waited. His silence somehow made the general's words hang in the air even more awkwardly. "General Blackwood," Admiral Richardson said carefully, "I believe you may want to reconsider your assessment of Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's qualifications and contributions before proceeding further with this briefing." But General Blackwood was beyond the point of careful consideration. Years of commanding respect through rank and reputation had made him unwilling to back down, especially in front of so many subordinates. "Admiral, I respect your judgment in naval matters, but strategic military planning requires experience that comes with age and rank. This young man, regardless of his potential, simply doesn't have the credentials to contribute meaningfully to a discussion of this importance." The general turned back toward the large screens, apparently considering the matter settled. "Now, shall we continue with the briefing? We have actual military decisions to make." The silence that followed was deafening. Admiral Richardson exchanged glances with the other admirals in the room, and something unspoken passed between them. It was Admiral Chen who finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of tension. "General Blackwood," he said, rising slowly from his chair, "before we continue, there's something about Lieutenant Commander Mitchell that you should know." Admiral Chen's words hung in the air like smoke from a fired cannon. General Blackwood turned slowly, his expression showing the first signs of uncertainty since the meeting began. The confidence that had carried him through his earlier comments began to waver as he noticed the serious expressions on every admiral's face. "What exactly should I know about the lieutenant commander?" General Blackwood asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Something in the room's atmosphere had shifted, and even his considerable ego couldn't ignore the change. Admiral Richardson stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "General, 3 days ago, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell single-handedly prevented what could have been the largest maritime disaster in modern history. He saved not only American lives, but potentially thousands of civilian lives across multiple nations." The general's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "I wasn't briefed on any major incidents in the past 72 hours. What are you talking about?" "Because," Admiral Chen interjected, "the incident was classified at the highest levels. Only those with direct operational need to know have been informed. The public will likely never hear the full story, and that's exactly how it needs to remain." Lieutenant Commander Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly preferring to remain in the background. But Admiral Richardson gestured for him to stand, and reluctantly, the young officer rose to his feet. "Tell him what happened, Commander," Admiral Richardson said gently. The general needs to understand why you're in this room." Mitchell took a deep breath before speaking, his voice steady but modest. "Sir, I was serving as the navigation officer aboard the USS Constellation when we received a distress signal from a civilian cargo vessel, the MV Atlantic Pioneer. The ship was carrying liquefied natural gas and had suffered a catastrophic engine failure in heavy seas approximately 40 miles from a major shipping lane." General Blackwood listened, but his expression suggested he was waiting for something more dramatic. "Engine failures happen, Commander. What made this situation special?" "The ship was drifting directly toward a collision course with 3 other vessels," Mitchell continued. 2 were passenger cruise ships carrying over 8,000 people combined, and the 3rd was a naval vessel from our allied fleet, but the real danger wasn't the collision itself. Admiral Stevens, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward in his chair. "General, the MV Atlantic Pioneer was carrying over 2 million cubic meters of pressurized liquid natural gas. If that ship had collided with any of those vessels, the explosion would have been equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. The thermal radiation alone would have killed everyone within a 2-mile radius." The color slowly drained from General Blackwood's face as the implications became clear. "How many people were in the potential blast zone?" "Over 12,000 souls," Admiral Richardson replied grimly. 3 cruise ships, a naval destroyer, 2 cargo vessels, and approximately 15 smaller craft. The explosion would have created a fireball visible from space and sent a tsunami-like wave in all directions. Mitchell continued his account, his voice remaining level despite the magnitude of what he was describing. "The problem was communication. The cargo ship's radio systems were severely damaged, and they couldn't coordinate with the other vessels. The weather conditions made helicopter rescue impossible, and there wasn't enough time to evacuate the other ships from the area." "So what did you do?" General Blackwood asked, now genuinely interested despite himself. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell did something that violated every regulation in the book," Admiral Chen said with unmistakable pride in his voice. "He convinced Captain Morrison to allow him to take a small boat in 40-foot seas during a storm to reach the disabled vessel." General Blackwood stared at Mitchell in disbelief. "You went out in a small boat during a storm? That's not heroic, Commander. That's suicide." "It was calculated risk, sir," Mitchell replied calmly. "I had studied the wave patterns and weather data. There was a brief window when the seas would calm slightly, lasting about 20 minutes. It was enough time to reach the ship if everything went perfectly." Admiral Richardson picked up the narrative. "What the commander isn't telling you is that he's not just any navigation officer. He holds a doctorate in maritime engineering from MIT and has published papers on emergency vessel stabilization. He knew exactly what needed to be done to prevent that ship from drifting into the collision course. But getting there was only half the problem," Admiral Stevens added. "The MV Atlantic Pioneer's crew was panicking. They couldn't understand the technical instructions being radioed to them, and their captain had been injured during the initial engine failure. Someone needed to board that vessel and personally oversee the emergency stabilization procedures." Mitchell nodded reluctantly. "The ship's ballast system was still functional, but it required manual operation from the engine room. Someone had to go down there and coordinate the weight distribution to stop the drift pattern. The crew didn't have the technical knowledge to do it safely." "So you boarded a ship carrying enough explosive material to level a small city," General Blackwood said slowly, "during a storm, and went into its engine room to manually operate systems you'd only studied in theory." "Not just theory, sir," Mitchell corrected respectfully. "I had worked on similar systems during my graduate research, but yes, I had never performed these procedures under emergency conditions on a vessel of that size." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the enormous risk that had been taken. Admiral Richardson walked to one of the large screens and pulled up a satellite image showing multiple ship positions in the Gulf waters. "The entire operation took 6 hours," Admiral Richardson explained, pointing to various positions on the screen. Commander Mitchell not only stabilized the drifting vessel, but coordinated with all the other ships in the area to create a safe evacuation corridor. He then remained aboard the Atlantic Pioneer until commercial tugboats could arrive to tow her to safety. Admiral Chen stood up and walked over to stand near Mitchell. What General Blackwood also doesn't know is that while the commander was risking his life on that cargo ship, he was simultaneously coordinating our current operation in the Gulf. The enemy vessels we've been tracking? They were using the chaos of the potential disaster as cover for their positioning. This revelation hit General Blackwood like a physical blow. Are you telling me that this lieutenant commander was conducting strategic military operations while performing a rescue mission? From the radio room of a crippled ship in a storm, Admiral Stevens confirmed. He identified the enemy movement pattern, calculated their probable intentions, and transmitted the intelligence that allowed us to position our forces for the current standoff. Without his analysis, we would have been caught completely off guard. Mitchell looked distinctly uncomfortable with the praise being heaped upon him. Sir, I was simply doing my job. Any officer in my position would have made the same decisions. Admiral Richardson shook his head firmly. No, Commander, any officer in your position would have followed standard protocol and waited for specialized rescue teams. You saved 12,000 lives and potentially prevented an international incident that could have led to war. The general stared at Mitchell with new eyes, seeing not a young officer who didn't belong, but someone whose actions had prevented a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The modest lieutenant commander had accomplished more in 3 days than many officers achieve in entire careers. There's one more thing, Admiral Chen said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. Commander Mitchell has been recommended for the Navy Cross for his actions. The ceremony was scheduled for next week, but given the current crisis, it's been postponed indefinitely. The Navy Cross. General Blackwood knew its significance. It was the Navy's second highest decoration for valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat or extreme peril. In the modern era, it was rarely given, and never lightly. As the full scope of Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's actions became clear, something fundamental shifted in the room's dynamics. The young officer standing quietly in the corner was no longer just another attendee at the briefing. He was a hero whose quick thinking and courage had prevented an international disaster and whose strategic insights were actively shaping their current military response. General Blackwood stood frozen in place, the weight of his earlier words pressing down on him like lead. The room remained silent, except for the steady hum of electronic equipment. But the tension had transformed from anticipation to something approaching reverence. Every person present understood they were in the company of someone extraordinary. Admiral Richardson moved to the central table and spread out a detailed tactical map. General, the reason Lieutenant Commander Mitchell is essential to this briefing is that his intelligence gathering during the Atlantic Pioneer incident revealed the enemy's true strategy. They weren't simply positioning for harassment of shipping lanes. They were creating a comprehensive blockade designed to force us into a confrontation. Mitchell stepped forward, his earlier reluctance replaced by professional focus. Sir, while coordinating with the other vessels during the rescue operation, I noticed unusual communication patterns from ships that appeared to be civilian cargo vessels. Their positioning and movement suggested they were actually military vessels in disguise. The lieutenant commander moved to the large screen and pointed to specific coordinates. These 3 positions here show vessels that maintained perfect triangulation, despite claiming to be independent cargo operations. No commercial shipping company coordinates that precisely unless they're following military protocols. Admiral Chen nodded approvingly. The commander's analysis allowed us to identify 12 enemy vessels that we had previously classified as neutral commercial traffic. Without that intelligence, we would have sailed directly into a trap. General Blackwood studied the tactical display with growing amazement. The young officer he had dismissed as unqualified had single-handedly unraveled a complex enemy deception that could have resulted in massive American casualties. "How did you recognize the deception pattern?" he asked, his voice now carrying genuine respect. "During my doctoral research, I studied historical naval blockade tactics dating back to World War II, Mitchell explained. The triangulation pattern being used is a modified version of tactics employed by German U-boat wolf packs in the Atlantic. It's been updated for modern technology, but the fundamental strategic principles remain the same." Admiral Stevens leaned forward, his expression intense. "General, what makes this situation even more critical is that Lieutenant Commander Mitchell has developed a counter-strategy that could neutralize the enemy blockade without firing a shot. His plan could prevent the international incident we're all trying to avoid." The general's eyebrows rose. After spending 20 minutes mocking this young officer, he was now learning that the same man might hold the key to resolving the entire crisis. "What's your recommendation, Commander?" Mitchell moved to another section of the map, his confidence growing as he entered his area of expertise. "Sir, the enemy's strategy relies on their ability to maintain communication between the disguised vessels while appearing to operate independently. If we can disrupt their communications without appearing to target them directly, their coordination will collapse. How do we do that without it looking like an act of aggression?" Admiral Richardson asked. "We create a false emergency," Mitchell replied, his eyes lighting up with the elegance of his solution. "We position one of our vessels to appear to suffer a communications malfunction in the center of their formation. Standard maritime law requires all vessels in the area to switch to emergency frequencies to assist with the rescue operation." Admiral Chen immediately grasped the brilliance of the strategy, which would force the enemy vessels to break their covert communication protocols. They'd have to either reveal themselves by refusing to help with the rescue or compromise their operation by switching frequencies. "Exactly," Mitchell confirmed. "Once they're forced onto emergency frequencies, we can legitimately monitor all their communications under international maritime rescue protocols. We'll be able to identify every enemy vessel and document their military coordination, giving us legal justification for any response." General Blackwood stared at the young officer with undisguised admiration. The strategy was elegant, legal, and virtually guaranteed to succeed without escalating the conflict. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came from combining deep theoretical knowledge with practical experience and creative problem-solving. "Commander," the general said slowly, "this plan could work. It's brilliant, actually. How long would you need to implement it?" "We could begin positioning our assets within 6 hours," Mitchell replied. "The entire operation could be completed within 48 hours, depending on how quickly the enemy responds to the simulated emergency." Admiral Richardson turned to address the room. "Gentlemen, I believe we have our strategy. Admiral Chen, please coordinate with Fleet Command to begin positioning our vessels. Admiral Stevens, work with intelligence to prepare monitoring equipment for the emergency frequencies." As the admirals began organizing the implementation of Mitchell's plan, General Blackwood approached the young officer privately. The transformation in his demeanor was complete. Gone was the arrogant commander who had dismissed Mitchell as unqualified, replaced by a humbled senior officer who recognized exceptional ability when he saw it. "Commander Mitchell," the general said quietly, "I owe you an apology. My comments earlier were inappropriate and based on assumptions that were completely wrong. Your service record and capabilities speak for themselves." Mitchell nodded respectfully. "No apology necessary, sir. I understand that my age and rank can create initial doubts about my experience. I'm used to proving myself through actions rather than appearances." The general extended his hand, which Mitchell shook firmly. "You've certainly done that, Commander. Your country owes you a debt of gratitude, and I personally owe you my respect." What happened next surprised everyone in the room. Admiral Richardson, who had been coordinating with Fleet Command, suddenly straightened to attention and rendered a sharp salute to Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. "Thank you for your service and sacrifice, Commander. It has been an honor working with you." One by one, the other admirals followed suit. Admiral Chen snapped to attention and saluted. Then Admiral Stevens. Admiral Martinez rose from his chair at the far end of the room and saluted. Finally, Admiral Thompson, who had been quietly observing the entire proceeding, stood and rendered his salute with obvious pride. 5 admirals, men who commanded aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and entire battle groups, stood at attention, saluting a lieutenant commander. The sight was unprecedented in the Pentagon's briefing rooms. These were officers who normally received salutes from thousands of subordinates, yet here they were, honoring a young man whose courage and intelligence had saved thousands of lives and prevented an international crisis. General Blackwood watched this extraordinary display with growing understanding. He realized that true leadership and heroism weren't measured by rank insignia or years of service, but by actions taken when lives hung in the balance. Mitchell had proven himself worthy of respect from the highest levels of military command, not through politics or connections, but through competence, courage, and character. Slowly, General Blackwood came to attention and rendered his own salute to Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. The room held its collective breath as the general, who had spent 20 minutes mocking the young officer's qualifications, now honored him with the respect he had earned through extraordinary service. Mitchell returned each salute with perfect military precision, though his face showed he was deeply moved by the unprecedented recognition. When the final salute was completed, the room seemed different somehow, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Admiral Richardson broke the silence. "Gentlemen, we have work to do. Commander Mitchell will coordinate directly with Fleet Command to implement his strategy. General Blackwood, we'll need your support for any air assets that might be required during the operation." As the briefing concluded and officers began filing out to implement the plan, General Blackwood lingered behind. He approached Mitchell one final time, his expression thoughtful. "Commander," he said, "I've learned something important today. Experience and wisdom don't always come with age or rank. Sometimes they come from someone young enough to see solutions that the rest of us miss, and brave enough to act when action is needed." Lieutenant Commander Mitchell smiled slightly. "Thank you, sir. I've learned something too. Sometimes the people who challenge us the most end up teaching us the most about ourselves." The general nodded and headed toward the door, but paused at the threshold. "Commander, when this crisis is resolved and you receive your Navy Cross, I'd be honored to attend the ceremony. You represent the very best of what our military can be." As General Blackwood left the room, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell returned to his seat in the corner and opened his notebook. There was still work to be done, a crisis to resolve, and lives to protect. But for one moment, in that room full of the Navy's most senior leadership, rank hadn't mattered. Only character, competence, and courage had counted. The young officer who had been dismissed as unqualified had proven that true leadership comes not from the insignia on your collar, but from the strength of your convictions and the willingness to act when others hesitate. In a world where respect is often demanded rather than earned, Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell had quietly earned the salutes of 5 admirals and the admiration of a general who had learned never to judge a book by its cover.